So how do levers work in Insight? The player approaches the lever, hold the interact button, choose the direction, WS or vertical stick. After 1 second, the lever switches state. So we're going to implement that in Unity. The lever setup is intentionally simple. The root object contains all the logic while the visuals are separated underneath. Only the handle rotates. The lever body itself stays completely still. The lever has 3 important components: the capsule collider, player input, and the lever script. The collider is marked as trigger so we can detect when the player is close enough to interact. So what happens in the interaction range? When the player enters the trigger, we simply enable the dedicated player input component attached to this lever. Leaving the trigger disables it again. This means the interaction controls only exist while the player is standing next to the lever. Unity already solved input routing, so there is no reason to reinvent it with extra booleans floating around the project. So the way input actions work is that instead of placing everything inside the normal player action map, I created a separate interact map. Begin simply tracks whether we're holding the interaction button, up activates the upper direction, and down activates the lower direction. The delay is also not coded anywhere. It's handled entirely by Unity's input system, using a hold interaction with 1 second duration. Now let's take a look at actual events. Once the player is inside the trigger, everything else is happening through the input system. Holding the interact button calls interact trigger from the player. Here I simply enable or disable the interact mode, and while it's active, I temporarily disable the player's normal movement input so the lever can take over. If you wish to know how the actual player script and this guide object work, make sure you take a look at my previous video on character movement. Now, if the player presses up or down while still holding interact, interaction indicator is called when the input starts. I launch a coroutine that gradually changes the color of the player from white to red over 1 second. If the player releases the button early, the coroutine is stopped and the indicator immediately resets back to white. This indicator is basically anything your character is doing. It's just the visuals of your interaction. Notice that I'm not measuring that 1 second inside the script. The delay is handled entirely by Unity's input system using a hold interaction. That means performed is only fired after the player has held the direction for a full second. When that happens, switch up or switch down is executed depending on the direction. First, I check whether the lever is already in that state, so I don't trigger unnecessary animations. If the state actually needs to change, I call switch state. This simply toggles the lever between on and off and starts the animation coroutine. Finally, trigger animation smoothly rotates the handle object from its current angle to its target angle, using quaternion slurp. Before starting a new animation, I also stop any previous coroutine, so rapidly switching directions never causes multiple animations to overlap. So that's the basic implementation of how interactions work in Insight. Other interactions are implemented on top of the system, which we will take a look at in the future videos. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.